Hi, everyone, and welcome to Explicitly Pro Life. I'm your host, Kristen Hawkins. Thanks so much for tuning in this week. We have a very special guest, and as you know, we're talking about winning pro life tactics. So we've asked our good friend Liz Wheeler to come on and share with us some of her best tips for how to win in the pro life movement. As you all know, Liz just released a brand new, highly anticipated podcast, Liz Wheeler Show. I hope you've subscribed already. If you haven't, you need to. I'm sure you've probably seen Liz and her clips before on TV, on your social media. She's in speaking on campuses across the country, been in news articles across the country. Politico has actually labeled her a titan of media. So welcome, Liz. Thanks for joining us today.
Kristen, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's good to talk with you again a little bit. I think the last time we spoke, it was like in the height of the COVID pandemic that was happening. Now it's a little bit different a year later. But I'm talking this specific season about some winning tactics. I've been interviewing different pro-life leaders from across the country who in their hometowns, in their states, are doing some really innovative things to kind of change up the game and to help us save more lives, get the message out about the violence of abortion and those who propagate abortion. But I wanted you to come on and talk about, how we can win in the media and how do we fight back against everything and the disinformation that we hear all the time in the news media.
Right. And it's a good question. And there's a lot of different answers, but I would say, first of all, remember that we are winning. And when I say we are winning, I mean we are winning the culture war, which is an important first step before we can win legislatively. But the pro-life movement, ever since Roe v. Wade, has put effort into winning the culture war. That means, of course, winning people's hearts and minds, winning public opinion. And we are winning that. Because if you do a survey, and this is not hypothetical, there have been surveys done, and you ask people, are you pro-life or are you pro-choice? Yeah, maybe a few more people say pro-choice. But when you actually ask specifically, do you support abortion in the first trimester, the second trimester, and the third trimester, over 80% of Americans, this includes pro-abortion and pro-life people, want third trimester abortion banned. Second trimester, over 60% of people want second trimester abortion banned. So we are winning the culture war. So the first thing to remember is that we're winning, and not because we should pat ourselves on the back, but just because it should energize us and encourage us to fight this fight. The second thing to remember is that we need to always know more than the other side. We need to anticipate what arguments they're making culturally, how they're trying to propagate and celebrate abortion, how they're trying to dehumanize both unborn babies and women, so that the first time we hear these talking points, we can debunk them before they take hold, before they have clung hold to our culture. We have to make sure that they don't. We've done a pretty good job of this. And the way that we've done so far, and this is what I always do, what I found most effective, is be realistic. And when I say be realistic, I mean, we want to talk about the reality of abortion. We don't want to go for shock value. We're not trying to just be gruesome, but we want to explain scientifically, this is when a life begins, and pair that with this is what the abortion procedure is. And then you don't have to tell the other person how to think. You don't have to tell the pro-abortion individual or the person that thinks, I don't personally believe in abortion, but I don't want to tell someone else what to do. You give those two things, the reality of when science says life begins and the reality of the abortion procedure, and you ask that person to justify the two things, and they can't because it's unjustifiable. And so if we keep plugging away, if we keep doing those two things, educating ourselves and making sure that we're ahead of the curve, that we know their arguments before they've disseminated them culturally, and we match that with the reality of both life and abortion, then we'll continue winning this fight.
That's awesome. And I couldn't agree more, because I think it's so frustrating when you hear the, CNN come out and say, oh, the majority of Americans remain in favor of Roe v. Wade and they're pro-choice. And it's always like, you have to read the polls. What were the questions that were being asked to the respondents, and how did they really respond? Because I know a lot of people get really confused, even on campuses when we're having conversations about labels, and people will be like, oh, which one? I'll say, are you pro-life or pro-choice? And students will literally ask, well, which one is that? I'm not I'm not real sure. And so I think that's really important, that we need to remember that we are winning. When you look truthfully at the polls, the culture is changing, and I think it is a question of how people
Yeah.
though refer to themselves. Though I think that is a common problem that we
Well,
have.
our generation, if I may interject, our
Yeah.
generation doesn't really, and Generation Z, even more than millennials, doesn't like being labeled. They don't like
Mhm.
identifying as Republican or Democrat. That's why there's so many more independents. I would say, in a sense, that's the same with pro-choice, pro-abortion, and pro-life. Young people don't like to be put into a box. They want to feel like they've formulated this opinion themselves, that they've thought about it independently, and that this is their position, not a position that's been handed down to them by someone else, not a position that's being assigned to them, not a position they're expected to have. They want to feel that it's theirs, that they own that position. And so I identify as pro-life, of course, because I know all it entails. I'm proud to be pro-life, but I'm not trying to assign that label to someone else. I just want them to justify when does life begin, and justify that with the abortion procedure. That's all I'm asking. I'm not asking you to be part of any movement that you don't want to be part of. I'm not asking you to associate with people you don't want to associate with. That's fine. Just justify the reality of life with the reality of abortion. The other thing, Kristen, that I've found has been a very effective tactic with people on the other side, and this has happened at speaking events, actually, when we're talking about abortion, and there'll be someone who's pro-abortion who comes up and challenges me. And a lot of times, if someone's if they adhere very strongly to their principles, we'll put it that way, or their viewpoints in that case, meaning they're very strongly abortion minded and they're not necessarily open to the reality of life and the reality of abortion. One of the tactics that works really well to get a productive conversation is the element of surprise, right? So what I mean by that is there are many things that people who are pro-abortion and people who are pro-life actually have in common. We actually agree with, right? And this surprises a lot of people, but one of the things that we really need to do to counter one of the left's most common arguments, you hear this all the time, I'm sure, is they immediately pivot to, what about rape? What about incest? What about life of the mother? Now, you and I know that that's less than 1% of abortions, and that the baby didn't do anything wrong, et cetera, et cetera. But they need to know, these pro-abortion advocates who immediately pivot to this very small fraction of abortions, they need to know that conservatives are compassionate, that we're not just dismissing these women, and we need to prove that to them, not just by saying, I'm compassionate and I'm sorry, that's awful, but we need to ask them, are you advocating for rapists to be held accountable? Do you know what percentage of rapists get away, not even by being convicted of a felony, but serve no jail time whatsoever? They don't know the answer to that. And if you ask them, well, why aren't you advocating for women like that when the people who have violated them, the criminals who have violated them, are walking the streets? And then you say, this is something we agree on. This is something that we have in common, an advocacy position that we share. So let's do this together and try to eradicate this problem. And then let's talk about the reality of life and abortion. And when you've caught them with the element of surprise, when you've shown them that you're being compassionate and advocating for something that you both share a belief in, you wouldn't believe how accidentally open-minded they become, at least in my experience.
Accidentally open-minded. I love that phrase. That's a great phrase. What are you seeing? I know you just launched this new podcast and you've been doing videos on social media and Instagram. I've been liking and sharing them. I'm not super proficient in Instagram,
Thank you.
I have a hard time figuring out how to put in my stories. But how are you getting around the big tech censorship? Have you noticed? I mean, we've certainly noticed at Students for Life. We've done some things that I can talk about publicly and some things I can't talk about publicly to kind of get around it, to avoid the issue. But how are you doing that? Because you're building up this whole new media empire with your podcast, with all the things you're doing on social media. Has this become a problem for you?
Well, yeah, big tech censorship is certainly real. And I say this as someone who originally, I have to admit, I didn't really think the censorship was as bad as people were portraying it to be at the very beginning. When big tech, when Facebook started stifling conservatives, I honestly thought, well, maybe your posts aren't that interesting. Maybe that's why they're not going viral. I was wrong. I now see how serious of an issue this is. And I have been the victim of this myself. Facebook has demonetized my page off and on. They've stifled my reach. I used to get millions and millions of views on my videos every single day. I would get that number. And now we're we get a fraction of that and a very small fraction of the reach that we used to get. YouTube has yanked videos. Instagram puts those fake fact checks on my videos all the time. You name it, we've experienced it. So I'm doing a couple of things. First of all, I'm not leaving those platforms because that's exactly what they want. They want to stifle my views. They want me not to put my content on their platform. So I'm going to stay on those platforms. And I encourage people, don't leave the platforms either. Just go and make sure you watch my content so that Facebook can't stifle me without entirely kicking me off, and they'd have no justification for doing so. So it would be bad PR for them. So that's number one. Number two, we launched the podcast in the format that we did on purpose, right? Because Apple and other podcast platforms have so far, and we hope they continue, have acted like platforms, meaning they're not acting like Facebook, a publisher, taking on an editorial role and stifling people or censoring people. They've allowed in large part, they've allowed podcasts to be published in whatever form, whatever content. They're not taking an editorial role. We certainly hope that continues. Fingers crossed, prayers up for that. And then the third thing we're doing is we are hedging our bets a little bit, meaning it's possible at any moment that any one of these big tech companies could censor us. And so I created a community, a Liz Wheeler Show community on Locals. And that's, of course, the social media platform started by Dave Rubin, free speech fanatic Dave Rubin. And we have tens of thousands of people over there already. He's committed to free speech in the sense that we can talk about whatever we want. You don't have to censor anything. You don't have to self-censor yourself or self-censor when you're talking about sometimes hot button issues or controversial topics. And people really appreciate the fact that we can have any kind of discussion that we want over there without the fear of big tech. That's sort of on the personal side. I mean, on the legislative side or the legal side, I, of course, support repealing Section 230 because I think that the big tech companies are in wild violation of that.
My son, I've been getting him to watch all the PragerU videos, and we were driving in Colorado a couple weeks ago, and he was like, yeah, Facebook, they just want to act like a platform when they go to court, but they act like a publisher every single day. And I'm like, what?
Excellent.
Wow. Those PragerU videos are
That must have been a very proud mom moment.
I know. My husband and I looked at each other and we're like, what did he just say? And he was dead on, baby. And I was like, you're exactly right, Gunnar. But it's definitely an issue. You're right. I'm always cynical of it too. Like, I've known some groups, I won't say names, where I'm like, you posted that knowing you were going to get kicked off of Facebook, YouTube after, when you posted it, and you did it for a fundraising purpose or a PR purpose. And so I think you have to be, a little wise about what we post and how we say things, because there are certain things that I know.
Right. Well,
if I would say
that's even
this,
self-censorship.
It is. It really is. But I think it's important to stay on.
That's the other thing that we do. Right. And that's the other thing that I make sure to do too. So whenever I talk about one of the hot button issues, whether that's the life and abortion issue, whether that's transgenderism, whether that's COVID and masks and science, I always make sure that I cite what I'm talking about so that if Facebook smacks one of those fake fact checks on me, I can point them to the scientific study that shows that lockdowns didn't work, empirical evidence that shows that, or I show the scientific studies about transgender puberty blocking drugs in children and how the FDA has not approved it for that purpose of blocking puberty. Whatever the hot button topic is, the issue is, I make sure to cite the scientific study or the basis for what I'm saying so that there can be no accusations of me being bombastic or sensationalist, which I'm not. I'm just speaking the truth calmly and bluntly and unapologetically, but so that there can be no true valid accusations of me spreading anything that's not true.
What do you recommend to the average pro-life student or pro-life activist in their community, how they can engage on social media in an effective way? Because we see the keyboard warriors who kind of get, my mother is one of them, who gets into like the fights with all their friends over an election and all the comments. And my mom will text me screenshot. Can you believe so and so said this? And I'm like, I don't know if you're changing their mind or just like they're not going to talk to you ever again after the election. What are your best tips for someone for how to effectively challenge someone to think and start that conversation to hopefully change their mind on abortion or whatever issue?
Well, the tactic that I use whenever I get into online or keyboard battles is I try to just stick with questions. as conservatives, I think we educate ourselves to the point that we always feel like we have this data dump that we can just drop on the other side, just like a nuclear bomb of information, and obliterate the radical leftist position on almost any issue, not just abortion. But you have to really, or what I really try to do is I really try to hold back that data dump and just pick one question that I feel exposes the fatal flaw in the radical leftist argument. So, for example, if I'm talking about abortion online, I'm not going to talk about, the reasons that people get abortions necessarily, or the statistics of how many abortions there have been, or even that they're disproportionately targeting African-American women, Black babies. I literally just say, well, scientifically, when does life begin? One simple question with a binary answer, right? It either begins at conception or it doesn't. Mm-hmm. If it does, then abortion is inherently morally wrong. If it doesn't, then whatever. But I don't say that part. Because people aren't stupid. Even the leftists aren't stupid in that sense. They can infer that for themselves. So I stick with one tiny question. When does life begin? Scientifically, when does life begin? And the same thing for almost any issue. If you engage that way, if you just ask questions, then pretty soon progressives will run out of their arguments. And who knows? Who knows if you'll change that person's mind, or if you'll just plant that seed in someone else's mind who's listening. But I found it to be pretty effective.
That's great. I love asking questions that are obviously lead to a binary answer that they don't want to answer. That makes them so angry. I've been using on campuses, and we were talking earlier about the labels. I don't even like to use the word pro-life along campuses because the label's loaded. People don't like labels. And so I'll just say, I'm anti-abortion. I'm like a lot of things. I take stances on a lot of different issues. I'm anti-abortion. And they hate that phrase because the question is, well, what are you? Are you with me anti-abortion, or are you pro-abortion? And no one likes the phrase pro-abortion. They get very, very angry with having to admit to themselves that they are, in fact, pro-legal abortion, which exposes the whole flaw of the abortion movement, that you have all these people that say they support you, but don't actually want to say that they support abortion. Which proves that.
Right. Of course they don't. Well, and the other thing that I try to remember when I'm debating individuals, and when I'm talking about individuals, I'm not talking about the lobbying organizations in the abortion industry. I'm talking about just individuals who may identify as being pro-abortion or identify as being pro-choice. That is very different than sort of obliterating, Planned Parenthood executives or Women's March talking heads or what have you. That's very different because, and this was actually a piece of advice told to me by a priest friend who works in bioethics. He said, remember when you're talking to the left, especially talking to women on the left or anybody who's really sympathetic to abortion, that either they or someone very close to them has had an abortion, right? So you're not trying to obliterate them. That's a very difficult thing to come to terms with if you have aborted your child. It is a difficult thing to come face to face with. And it's not going to help if we're just trying to, smack them down and get clicks for that. What we need to do is we need to talk science. We need to speak reality to them, and we can do that firmly, but also gently in a way that can allow them to change their mind while still saving face, versus they're not going to stand there and admit that they're wrong if they're going to be completely humiliated by it. So save the humiliation for people like Planned Parenthood. Great. Smack them down. Show everyone that they're hypocritical, blood and money thirsty, just terrible people, basically. But individuals that you're talking to who are sympathetic for abortion, remember what the basis of their experience is. And from that perspective, you'll be more effective bringing them over to our side versus just taking them off or making them angry.
Yeah, I think it's about planting seeds, right? And I think if you think about it as that, as opposed to, I must leave this conversation, I can't leave this conversation until you tell me you've changed my mind. That's not going to end well. It's planting the seeds that will be, harvested later in life. Okay, so what do you do? And I'm sure you've had this experience on social media. What do you do with cyberbullying? How do you handle the cyberbullying that I'm sure you face?
I kind of just ignore it, to be honest. I'm pretty thick-skinned to begin with, so I'd say up to like 90% of insults either don't bother me at all or kind of make me laugh, because a lot of times people who are hurling the insults are dumb and their insults aren't even good insults. So it doesn't, I'm not an inherently I'm not an inherently sensitive person in that way, which I'm grateful for, right? That's part of my armor. That's part of, it's a blessing from God, honestly, that I'm not, because it enables me to fight this fight without feeling pierced by all these arrows all the time. When it does bother me, I ignore it. And I make sure that I surround myself with people who appreciate the work that I'm doing, who share my values, who affirm me for who I am, and who don't view me just as, you know, my public job, my job in the public eye, who view me just as a wife and a mother and a sister and a daughter and a lifelong, you know, girlfriend, not someone who just looks at me on the basis of what I do for a living. And when you do separate work and home life, or work and personal life, it's a lot easier to step away from those insults and not to feel that you're shaken to the core by someone coming after you, because that's just what you do basically at the office. That's what you do in your day job. That's what you do. And I'm not saying day job in the sense that I don't work 24/7. I'm saying that it's an easier way to mentally separate those things when you have that support group that I don't know, loves you for who you are versus looking for that validation, I guess, publicly.
I couldn't agree with that more. I get asked this question a lot from young pro-lifers, especially those who've just started out with their Students for Life group on campus. And instantly, I mean, we've seen a huge rise in cyberbullying in the last couple of years. It's been, you know, it's something that's been very difficult for a lot of young people. And it's, you know, don't look for validation online. Like, I could care less what people on Facebook or Twitter say to me. Like, those people do not define who I am and my value and my worth. And I think you do.
I tell young people too. Definitely. And I tell young people too. I remember speaking at a pro-life conference, and, you know, this young man came up to the microphone and, you know, he looked a little beaten down. He was like, I agree with everything you're saying, but when I talk about this among my friends, I'm told that I'm a misogynist. And he really looked like that hurt him to the core, because he was trying to respect women. He was trying to protect women and unborn women. And he's like, how do I deal with this? And so I just asked him, I was like, are you a misogynist? And he goes, no. And I was like, then why do you care what they say? And he goes, oh. And so I think, and that really is instructive though. It's instructive to teach young people how to process that cyberbullying. So if someone calls you a name, you can ask yourself, well, am I a bimbo? No, I'm not a bimbo. I'm a smart woman. Doesn't matter what color my hair is. Just because I'm blonde doesn't mean that I'm a bimbo. So who cares what the other people say? They're obviously wrong. Right? And the same thing for every insult. You know, are you trying to oppress women? No, we're not trying to oppress women. We're not trying to control their bodies. So who cares if someone says you are? And
that's so funny.
If you teach young people how to process it like that, it's a lot easier, I think, to process.
Yeah, no, it's so funny that I never, bimbo isn't a word that comes up if you have brown hair, I guess. You get called other names. But I always joke that, like, either Lila, Abby, or myself needs to dye our hair blonde because we all three have brown hair. We're all three converts to the faith. And so we get mixed up all the time. Like, I'll be at events and somebody will complain to me about somebody else's face that I didn't even post, you know. But I'm like, yes, I know we're all brown-haired pro-life girls, so one of us needs to go blonde eventually.
That's so funny.
But then I'll have to be prepared for the bimbo insults, I guess, because I get called lots of other fun things. But yeah, I think that's the main thing, is you can't be looking for the validation. You know in your heart what you're striving to do, the truth you're seeking to push out there and to save lives, to help women. Who cares what they call you? And they're never really going to like you. I mean, and I think that's a hard realization sometimes, to realize if you're doing the right thing, there will always be people who hate you for what you're doing.
Yes. Definitely. All right, so, I mean, the Bible tells us that, right? So from a Christian perspective, we're literally told that we will be condemned for his name. So in a sense, you have to accept that, but it's difficult. But I understand that that's difficult for a lot of people to accept, but you're going to have to come to grips with it.
Yeah, I think you should look at it as like a good thing. Like, if I get a lot of hate mail, I'm like, yes, I did something good this week. So if you turn it around, like, I actually get mad if I don't get enough hate comments, because obviously we haven't been doing enough to get out there. Okay, so what would be your advice? I was reading something the other day, and they said, like, the number one thing that, like, high schoolers today are saying they want to become in life is a social media influencer. Like, that's like the number one job that they want to score. I know. I had to laugh, and I was a little confused by that and a little scared. But we have seen some amazing young leaders who've just started, an Instagram channel, and they're doing amazing work, like rebutting whatever craziness is that's out there. They're like little Liz Wheelers. What would be your advice to someone who wants to become a Liz Wheeler, who wants to be an online media expert and influencer?
I'm probably not the best one to give advice about Instagram. That one's not really my strength. I'm more of a Twitter. FYI. I do have an Instagram channel, and I work really hard to make sure that there's good content for people on there. But I have to admit, I prefer Twitter as a platform. I prefer words over visuals when I'm trying to reach young people. So maybe I'm not the one to ask on that. But truthfully, if you want to become an Instagram influencer or a social media influencer, I hope you're not talking about just like a bikini model or a fit chick or something like that. Because if that's what your aspirations are, raise the bar just a little bit. Raise the bar. In all seriousness, if you want to succeed in politics, if you want to become a thought leader, then you need to have something to offer. Right? You need to have something that you are saying that is valuable to other people, not just other people who are everyday citizens living their lives, but also people who are fighting the fight. If you want to be a thought leader, you have to have insight that other people are dying to hear. So the way that you have insight that other people want to hear is you need to be educated. You need to be as educated as possible. You need to read as much as possible, read as many books as possible. Just immerse yourself in information, because when you get inside the information, you will see the reality. You will let the information lead you to the natural conclusion. And oftentimes people on the other side aren't educated. They aren't informed. They aren't looking at the facts. They're not letting data and information lead them to natural conclusions. They're just basing it on emotion or what they've been told or false information that they've never verified. So if you want to be an influencer, then educate yourself. I did this by reading as many books as I possibly could.
That's awesome. And I think that's so valuable advice. I know anytime I read any book, and it's so hard for me to have time to read books anymore with 4 kids. So I have to download them and I have to like hide under my covers and read them at night. But anytime I do that, I'm like flooded with ideas like, oh my gosh, we have to do this. Why aren't we engaging this? We need to talk about this. I think my staff's like, oh gosh, she's reading another book. Just stop her now. The ideas start flowing. And I think that is so, so important. And there's a lot of folks out there. I mean, I was watching an interview that Charlie gave the other day on Fox, Charlie Kirk, and I was like, what book did he just reference? I just need to read it because I don't know what he's talking about. And so you'll hear other influencers speak about books that they've read, folks that they listen to, podcasts they listen to, or columns they read. And so if you have folks like that, I know Michael Knowles does a whole like book club thing on PragerU. And so he's constantly talking about other authors that he's read and thought leaders. And so if you like what Michael Knowles says, then you should read the books that he's talking about, because that's where he's getting his insights. That's so, so important. Thank you, Liz, for your time today. I'm so excited for you to come on and share some of these tactics for us for how to kind of make sure we're not censored on social media, how we can get the message out, how we can be effective on social media and online. Where does everyone go to follow you and to subscribe to your podcast and get all these awesome videos that you're putting out?
Very easy. LizWheelerShow.com. Basically, if you want to watch or listen to the podcast, it's on almost every podcast platform. You can go to Apple Podcasts, which is the one I recommend, actually. If you could subscribe to the podcast there, give us a 5-star rating and a glowing review, that'd be great. If you do subscribe, it helps us go up the charts, which helps more people discover it and helps more people hear reality, which we need. But you can also, if you must, follow it on Spotify or Pandora or iHeart or YouTube or Rumble or whatever your choice of video or audio platform is. But LizWheelerShow.com is where you can find all that information, and you can follow me at Liz_Wheeler on Twitter or wherever I have a blue check mark on social media.
Blue check mark. Always look for the blue check mark. Thanks for your time today. Thanks for all that you're doing. Thanks for all that you're doing to kind of dispel what we're hearing in the mainstream media with facts, with reason that we can then take out and use on our conversations online or in person on campuses or in our churches. So thanks, Liz, for what you're doing. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to this episode of Explicitly Pro-Life. Make sure you subscribe and share this episode with every aspiring social media influencer you know. Bye, guys.